right, well, I may as well get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Webinar 5, Risk Assessment and Implementing Floodplain Management. My name is Emily Amon, and I'm the Water Programs Lead for Green Communities Canada, joining you today from the traditional territories of the Hul'qumi'num and Senkotan-speaking peoples. This webinar is the fifth and final in the series of 5 weekly webinars we've been producing to share information about the floodplain mapping project that took place with the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation along Deshkan-Zibi, also known as the Thames or Antler River. This is the final webinar, and so we'll miss seeing you each week, but we appreciate all those who have come out over the past few weeks over their line shore just after. Please note we'll be keeping everyone's mic muted during the presentation today so that we can cut out any background noise that might make it hard for us to hear the speaker. We're also recording the webinar today so that it can be shared and viewed by those who couldn't attend at this time today. Sorry about that. All past webinars, as well as links to the slides, are available on the Green Communities Canada YouTube page. Today's session is the final webinar of the series and will build off of the information given throughout these past 5 weeks. The focus of this webinar will be looking at risk assessment, as well as tools that can assist in managing risk, such as flood forecasting and the use of nature-based solutions to adapt and mitigate risks, as well as other effects of climate change. The purpose of this webinar is to share this information with you, but it's also to gather feedback from you on the content and delivery of webinars and how you'd like to see future information shared. So please feel welcome to share any feedback you may have with us in the chat box or in the survey link that we will share with you after the presentation. The survey will also be sent out over email to all past participants after today's session, as well as with links to the YouTube channel, which also has links to the slides. We have a pretty full agenda this afternoon and may not have time at the end of the presentation for a full Q&A, so please take note of the contact information of presenters, which has been included at the end of each presentation for follow-up. We've extended our meeting by about 15 minutes this afternoon for anyone who would like to stay on to ask a few questions after the presentations are through. You may also type questions in the chat box, which will be monitored by Brennan. If we're unable to answer a question today, please follow up via email with the presenter your question was directed at. Please take a moment now to type in the chat box your name and what community or organization you're from. This will help us to keep track of who has attended. Thanks, everyone. That's all from me, and I'll now turn it over to Courtney Riley for our traditional opening.
Apojo, Chippewas Chicago's Nipkibanasi Dodam. Deshkan-Zibi Don Jiba or Jiboinish Nabe Queen Dow. Courtney Riley Shagna, she knows when. My spirit name is Springwater Woman. I belong to Thunderbird Clan. I'm from Deshkan-Zibi, or also known as Chippewas of the Thames First Nation. And my English name is Courtney Riley. I'm going to start off with a prayer and do a song, and I'll talk a little bit about the song after the prayer. Young Minokish get Nango. Migwatch, Bijam Nado, Minoko Mazuin. Migwatch, Bijam Nado, Knigigo Gajatoyan. Migwatch, Shomaskizis, I'll give you a citrium Nango. Migwatch, Nokomaskizis, I'll give you a citrium to Bikut. Migwatch, Shakmiqueg, Miziang Nesiwan, Miziang Nipe, Miziang Matago, Miziang Wasiak, Miziang Nangog. Asima Biginang, Wabanang, Jawanang, Epigishmak, meanwhile, Gibagnang, Nadamokshanang, Vijavishnang, Kinigego, Eshtigayang, Nigan, Nikayam, Pane, Wewene, Apogibach. And just to provide that in English, I just thank the Creator for the beautiful day, and thank you, Creator, for this beautiful life, and thank you, Creator, for everything that you do for us. Thank you to Grandfather Sun for shining on us today. And thank you, Grandmother Moon, for shining on us tonight. Thank you, Mother Earth, for everything, for the water, for the air, for the trees, for the animals, and for the stars. I offer my tobacco to the 4 directions, the east, the south, the west, and the north. And I ask you to help us and be with us in everything that we do. And humbly, respectfully, thank you. So I'm doing a pre-recording today. It's a little chilly out this morning, and my phone is calling for rain all day. And so I'm here at the back of my house here on Chippewas, the Thames, and under the shelter of my deck here, and just wanted to provide this song because I didn't want to be standing in the rain in case it was raining. So the song I'm going to share is the snake medicine song. And this song I learned from Vern Hardwick. And she offered that she likes to sing this song before she takes medicines. I also find this song to be a really good healing song. And when when I think about snakes, I think about, the snake sheds its skin. And the skin, like the snake, as it's crawling along the earth, it's touching all of the medicines. And so that skin has all the medicines on it. There's also stories, Ojibwe stories about the thunderbirds coming and taking those snakes out of the water. And so I really like to think of this song too as drawing out any kind of toxins or any kind of unwellness in our bodies too. That's why I find this song to be a really good healing song as well. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about the song. And really quick, sure.
Gitchi Miigwech, Courtney, for another fantastic opening. I have personally loved hearing a new song that is related to the conversations that we are having. Such a great way to demonstrate how embedded our connection with Mother Earth is and to demonstrate it in such a memorable way. Anin Bojo, Minugijika, Carrie-Anne Charles, Dishnakaz, Ashunyan Dunjipa, Mayengan Dodam, Anishna Bekwe, and Dow. Hello, my name is Carrie-Anne. I'm from Georgina Island First Nation, also known as Shining Waters or Lake Simcoe. I'm of the Wolf Clan and I am a proud Anishinaabe woman. I'm the Environment Partnership Coordinator for Cambium Indigenous Professional Services and have been your moderator for this series. Bean welcome. As mentioned by Emily, we have yet another full agenda today, and this is the final of 5 webinars that have been developed through our project, Floodplain Mapping and Integrated Watershed Management with the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, a shared watershed with a shared responsibility and an educational journey. This project has been funded by Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada through their ADAPT program. Hopefully you have been joining us over the past few weeks, but if you have not, and this is your first time, we have had the privilege of working with all 4 communities that are situated within the Lower Thames watershed along the Thames River, or Deshkanzibi as it is known to the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, the lead community for this project. The other communities include Oneida of the Thames First Nation, Munsee Delaware Nation, and Delaware Nation of Moraviantown. There have also been many other awesome project partners as represented on the top of the slide deck, in which you can learn more about on the registration page, as well as other participants such as the City of London and the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, who have shared knowledge as well as have committed to continuing to work together to protect and preserve that in which sustains us all. This is a phased project, and phase 2 is the project that we have been sharing with you throughout this series. We believe that this project is a great example of Albert Marshall's two-eyed seeing and Willie Ermine's ethical space concepts being actioned. These sessions have all been packed with information we have learned about on a high level, the processes involved in floodplain mapping, from the hydrology to warning, as well as how we as community members can contribute. We have also had opportunities to hear from community members about the Indigenous perspectives of water, including the connections that form the foundations of our very existence. These webinars have been geared primarily for the Indigenous communities, as well as those non-Indigenous folks that are undertaking this type of work or any environmental initiative. As mentioned, this final session will build off the information given throughout these past 4 weeks. The focus of this webinar will be looking at the risk assessments as well as tools that can assist in managing risk, such as flood forecasting and the use of nature-based solutions to adapt and mitigate risks, as well as other effects of climate change. On that note, there may not be a lot of time for questions, so we ask that you please type your questions in the chat box. And if we do not get to them today, we suggest that you email one of our team directly, and those emails have been put in the chat box. The team was able to answer all of the questions throughout the sessions last week, so there are no questions to post this afternoon. Lastly, I want to acknowledge that yesterday was World Water Day, and to reiterate the importance of protecting and preserving Nabi, as these are the lifelines of Mother Earth. Next slide. If you have had an opportunity to join us over the previous webinars, this will be a familiar face as I call upon Mark Peacock to start off this final session. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Is on risk assessments. The whole idea here is to give some idea of the elements of a risk assessment and how that needs to be used by a First Nation, and how the input from the Chippewas, Thames, and other First Nations meant that we took a slightly different view of the way we went. So the first bit, I'm going to go through some of the basics of risk assessment, some of the elements by using one example that are usually in risk assessments, and then further talk about how we understand what a First Nation values in understanding its risk. Next, please. So what is risk? It's exposure of something that you value to danger or harm. So what you value is an important piece. And as a settler community, we have to be very careful as technical people supporting a nation doing work like this, that we understand that nation may value something than something different than what we would bring to the table. So in flood risk, it's the danger and the harm that we usually look at with regards to people and the things that they own. But does that need to be changed when we look at what a First Nation values? Next, please. So hazard versus risk. The hazard is the thing that will potentially harm you, and the risk is the likelihood that that hazard will cause you harm. So we look at likelihood and we look at hazard in the equation. Next. So to understand risk, what we first did is we looked at more of a traditional settler approach to risk. And this can be found in many pieces of software. There's automated ways of doing this. There is manual ways of doing it. And then what we wanted to do is look and work with First Nation to look at what the community wanted to bring to that. And we are continuing to work on that as we speak now. Next, please. So step one was to assess the risk. We looked at a couple of methods. The HIRA method, which is the hazard identification and risk assessment that is used across Ontario, and ICLEI, which is a method used for climate change adaptation generally. And I'm going to concentrate on the HIRA just as an example to give you an idea of the types of elements in a traditional risk assessment. Next, please. The second step is to meet with the community and staff, and we're working at that right now, and then determine how the risk assessment needs to be revised to properly reflect and appreciate what traditional knowledge from the community is bringing to this understanding. Next, please. So in the HIRA approach, it's pretty straightforward. It identifies risks with a focus on emergency programs that are generally offered by municipalities. It's one tool, once again. It's a systematic approach, but there are many other tools out there to use. I'm using this as an example so you can see the elements that are in most risk assessments. Next, please. So once again, it's very simple, and risk is a relationship between the frequency of the hazard happening and the consequence that is to the things that you value. And then there are different equations also associated with how you can mitigate that changes the overall scoring of the risk. Next, please. So risk is probability with consequence. So probability times consequence equals risk. Next. And what are those consequences? These are lists that are often used. There are in many of the different risk assessment tools. There are software programs like the Hydraulic Engineering Center has a risk assessment tool that you can use. There are other tools out there. Different provinces have designed some pretty good pieces of software for this, but you look at fatalities, injuries, how many people have to be evacuated, property damage, how your critical infrastructure will survive the flood, the environmental damage, the damage to what's happening in the community, its business and its finances, and finally, how it affects the people, the psychological effects or impacts of the flood. Next, please. So, with fatality, often, because of what we get out of the floodplain modeling, we're looking at things like the velocity of the flow, the depth of the flow, and then we often use a criteria which is a product rule of depth times velocity. So with velocity, we look at what type of flows sweep people off their feet. We look at depth, we look at what types of depth of flow will float people. And often we look at different types and ages of people. And so these numbers change. These are some of the numbers that have been used in the past. And then depth velocity is that when you go into a flooded situation, if you have a velocity of water and a flotation and a lifting from that, then you cannot withstand the impact of that to the same velocity and depth if there is those components are not additive. Next, please. With injury, we look at the same types of things. We can go on to evacuation. So in evacuation for the different floods, you'd look at the number of people in the floodplain, the depth in the building, and the type of building to determine whether those buildings would have to be evacuated. And that is a particularly important thing to understand because that creates massive disruption to your community. Next, please. Property damage. We look at generally, you break property damage down based on the amount of flooding into the building. This is one way of doing it. There are many others. We look at structural damage being above a certain amount of flooding, cosmetic damage, and then no damage at all. But that's just one way of looking at it. But property damage and the damage to buildings is an important piece of understanding the risk the community is going to face. Next, please. Critical infrastructure, really important. And we're talking about the things that hold vulnerable people, the things that are needed during times of emergency, and the things that make the community work during a problem time. And so we need to understand all the exposure of all these types of infrastructure to the flood and the hazard that we're trying to address. Next, please. Environmental damage. This is one way of looking at environmental damage, and this very clearly could be something that a First Nation would want to provide some more traditional understanding to myself as an engineer or whoever was working for them on something like this. Often environmental damage is talked about in terms of cleanup, but this may not be something that really resonates with the community. They may want the consultant or whoever to look at environmental damage because of flooding in a different way. And that's very much in play. The community needs to define how they want to understand risk to their community from an event like flooding. Next, please. Business interruptions. This is all about flooding out businesses and what that will mean to the community. And this may include, in some areas, you include things, there are some assessments about structures that could create pollution into the floodplain as well with regards to this type of thing. So there's a number of elements that could be considered in this category. Next slide. Psychological impact. This is really important. This is something that's often not thought about. I have been involved with flooding for many years, and I remember many times people telling me when we've evacuated communities that the impact on the elderly being moved is way more than just having to go somewhere. And really, it's important that we understand these impacts because this really does have effect on a community. And so often a little bit harder to understand because there is not the same types of numbers when we look at psychological impacts in the risk equations, but really, really important thing. Next slide. So then the next question is, what is the community value? What is the thing that is at risk in your First Nation that you really, it may be a sacred site. It might be something that as settler people, we just don't understand the way that traditional knowledge and the community understands. And this is the important thing, that this piece gets right. The other stuff is pretty straightforward in many of the different methods, but in a First Nations community, this community impact is something that really needs to be looked at. Next slide. So then you can look at both moderating, which is decreasing the risks, and increasing the risk. So is the human population getting older and therefore the risk is increasing? Are the hazards increasing over time? Is the built out environment getting more resistant to all these impacts? Those types of things and the interaction of the community with the flood can either be increasing or next slide, or decreasing, or next slide, increasing. So these are the types of factors that have to be brought into your understanding of risk. And also, if you are seeing the increasing and decreasing, it also brings into question how you need to address the risk, because you may be going in the right direction, but you actually might be going in the wrong direction. And so it's something that the community really needs to consider. Next slide, please. So lots of data. One of the things we need to get information from the floodplain model, the hydraulic model. It has to be for a number of different events, and that's what we use. The probability would be the return period of the storm, and then we would assess the consequences as I just described for that. Next, please. So frequency, once again, it's per storm and consequence. We used a lot of different guidelines to come up with like that 0.8 meters and that. And there are a number of guidelines out there. So the consultant that's working for you can look at those types of things. And even in a number of models, that's already preset. But one of the things to look at for a community, what is the depth of flooding that you think your community can withstand? And make sure that the risk assessment addresses your understanding of your community. And you know, you want some of this written information to guide you, but it's really important that the community understand its risk in its terms. Next slide, please. Frequency, once again, this is an example where we take all the way from annual all the way to a 100-year event, and we break up our categories of frequency based on return period. That was mapped, and we know everything that's contained within each one of those inundation return periods, and therefore we can assess what the consequences are for every flood. Next, please. Here is an example of property damage where you go and look at the property. Is it going to have 0.8 meters of flooding or not? And you would count up all the properties and you'd look at what that means for an overall risk for the community, whether it's no risk all the way to severe risk, where you have many structures that are destroyed. Next. Once again, community concerns. How do you make the community concerns, the community values be represented in a risk assessment? And that really is the important question in the conversations and in the understandings that First Nations communities can give to the people that are doing some of these technical work. Next slide, please. Overall comment is that frequency is really important. If you are seeing flooding every year and it's creating consequences, that is high risk. It's really hard because often in floodplain work, we say we are going to we are going to map out the worst storm every 100 years. And therefore, we're going to protect people to that. But the reality is in many of our communities, people are in the floodplains, and we need to know how severe the risk is to those people. So frequency is a major element of understanding this. And without the mapping of each event for each frequency, you really can't do that. And I can't stress enough the importance of talking to the community and making sure that the needs of the community are in the risk or assessment process. Next slide, please. So once you've developed risk and you understand that in an address, and there were two different methods that I showed the two, but went through the one. The next is to figure out what you're going to do about it. Once you've incorporated the community input, you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do about it. Next slide. And that's what the other presentations today will talk about. Thank you very much.
Once again, thank you, Mark, for yet another high-level yet informative overview to give us an idea of the process in completing this work and the importance of ensuring that not only the Indigenous perspective is being captured and incorporated, but the community perspective as a whole is also taken into account, and meaningfully so. We will now turn it over to a community member to reiterate this information. And so I welcome back Roussel Smith from the Chippewas of the Thames.
For -ZB, which roughly. Hi, this video is about floodplain risks and opportunities for -ZB, which roughly translates to Antler River in Ojibwe. Most of you may know it as the Thames River. Climate change presents risks and opportunities for adaptation and resiliency, locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. -ZB is comprised of roughly 3,200 band members on and off reserve. Our reserve lands consist of 10,880 acres with the ability to purchase 5,100 more additions to reserve land from our Big Bear Creek land claim settlement. Our nation is part of the Algonquin linguistic group, and we are located on the north bank of the Thames River. Groundwater under direct influence of surface water. Chippewas of the Thames water source for community consumption comes from the aquifers located near the Thames River. These aquifers are influenced by surface water, and as you know, the river has many contributing factors to its water quality grading. Because of this, any river flooding has an impact on our water source. The flooding and poor quality of the water contribute to the nation's standing boil water advisories. A lot of Chippewas of the Thames lands in the floodplain have issues around bank erosion. This is concerning because our community members utilize the banks for fishing, hunting, and social use. The river is a known home to species at risk, and as flooding continues, erosion will continue to occur, thus eliminating prime habitat, impacting social use, whether that be community safety, and an impact on the livelihood. Higher water levels and flooding from more extreme weather events impact the floodplain, contributing to bank erosion. Another risk is slope stability. As you can see, River Road is at risk of falling into the river. Unstable slopes and bank erosion in the floodplain are creating hazards for roads, vehicle safety, and community transportation networks. If the slope isn't stabilized soon, Chippewa may lose more of its roadway, which means some community members may find it difficult to access their homes or prime hunting, fishing, and agricultural lands.
Miigwech, Roussel, for that insight and reiterating the fact that there is a lot that needs to be considered from the individual community perspective and even from a community member perspective that needs to be taken into account. Up next, we have Krystal-Anne from the Canadian Environmental Law Association to speak with us about flood risk management and community resilience and give a couple of examples of policy approaches and tools. Over to you, Krystal.
Oh, sorry, I was muted there. Thanks, Carrie-Anne. So my name is Krystal, and I'm a lawyer and water policy coordinator at the Canadian Environmental Law Association. And as Carrie-Anne mentioned, my presentation is going to focus on flood risk management and community resilience and provide two examples of policy approaches and tools used to manage flood risk, one from the settler context and one Indigenous approach. Next slide, please. So in terms of a settler example of flood risk management, we're going to look at Ontario's policy approach to managing flood risks. But it is worth noting that this general approach is pretty consistent across the country. So Ontario's approach is based around the avoidance first principle, meaning that the general rule is not to build in a floodplain. This policy approach is based on the 5 core components of emergency management, which are prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the first two, prevention and mitigation. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by prevention? As an overall principle for flood management, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry prioritizes the use of non-structural and land use planning measures as its preferred approach to managing flood risks. Essentially, that means, again, there's a general rule or preference not to build in a floodplain. The prevention approach requires the identification of hazardous areas, including floodplains, so that municipalities can plan to prohibit or limit activities, including development in those areas. And the main legislative tools used to support this approach include the Planning Act, together with the Provincial Policy Statement and the Conservation Authorities Act. Next slide. So I'll move on to mitigation, which is the second component of Ontario's emergency management framework. And mitigation means actions taken to reduce the effects of flooding and includes the use of structural measures and floodproofing standards to protect development. Structural measures can include things like dams, dikes, diversions, and other flood control works, while floodproofing standards can include a combination of measures incorporated into the basic design of buildings to reduce or eliminate flooding hazards. For example, constructing the lowest occupancy floor of dwellings above the flood level. The use of structural measures or flood-proofing standards is not the preferred policy approach to mitigating flood risk because these measures are costly to build and maintain. They're not resilient to climate change generally and present increased residual risk to people and property if they fail. Further, failing to keep people out of floodplains by using structural measures inspires a false sense of security and encourages further development in those areas. So instead, Ontario's policy approach is intended to prohibit development in flood-prone areas, or in very special circumstances, allow for strictly limited development. Next slide. So what are those very special circumstances where development will be allowed? One of the exceptions to the general avoidance first principle is called a special policy area. This is an area within a community that has historically existed in the floodplain and where site-specific policies are intended to provide for the continued viability of existing uses and address the significant social and economic hardships to the community that would result from strict adherence to provincial policies. So in these special circumstances, there's often greater reliance on other tools in the emergency management framework, like structural measures, flood protection berms, flood proofing, and flood warning systems. Next slide. So an example of a special policy area is the Evergreen Brickworks. Evergreen Brickworks is Canada's first large-scale community environmental center, and it is located in the Don Valley, which is a floodplain. The Brickworks is a site of a former quarry, paper mill, and industrial brick factory. Evergreen Brickworks is an exception to the general rule regarding development in a floodplain, and it's a settler example of attempting to address the harms of the past, specifically contamination from past industrial use, through adaptive reuse, brownfield remediation, and ecological restoration. So today, Evergreen Brickworks consists of 16 remaining heritage buildings and adjacent 16 hectare public park that includes wetlands, hiking trails, and wildflower meadows. Next slide. So we've gone over the settler approach, which generally prohibits building in a floodplain. Now I want to spend some time speaking to an Indigenous approach to flood risk management, which is the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu, or TCAM. The Indigenous title of the TCAM roughly translates into doing something the Anishinaabe way, or going back to the old ways to help us move forward into the future. Next slide. The TCAM was developed by a diverse group of collaborators representing tribal, academic, intertribal, and government entities in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And the TCAM provides a framework to integrate Indigenous and traditional knowledge, culture, language, and history into the climate adaptation planning process. It is an extensive collection of climate change adaptation actions for natural resource management, organized into tiers of general and more specific ideas. So while the first version of TCAM was created based on Ojibwe and Menominee perspectives, languages, and concepts, it was intentionally designed to be adaptable to other Indigenous communities, allowing for incorporation of their language, knowledge, and culture. So it really is a menu, which means it provides options that can be used by different communities. It by no means mandates that all options have to be used if they would not be appropriate in a given circumstance. Instead, it does provide options for the community to kind of pick and choose what approach works best for their needs and interests. So essentially, the TCAM tries to respond to the need and facilitate culturally appropriate climate adaptation. Next slide. The TCAM offers a number of ways to proactively address changing water patterns to manage flood risk.
And I just pulled a couple examples of this and put them on the slide here. So the first strategy 14.2, provides some options for enhancing the ability of ecosystems to retain water. And some of the suggested tactics for doing so include thinning forests around wetlands to reduce interception and maintain water levels, or restoring previously drained wetlands and mimicking beaver dams to increase water storage on the landscape. Another strategy 14.3, speaks to adjusting systems to cope with increased water availability and high water levels by means of proactive planning. And this includes things like promoting a mix of beings in riparian areas, including beings that can tolerate floods and saturated conditions, increasing protected setbacks for water bodies to prevent flood damage, or diverting culverts and road crossings to accommodate increased water levels. And then the last example I pulled here, strategy 14.5, is all about adjusting the location and size of forested areas to new or changing water levels. So some suggestions in the TCAM include encouraging native shoreline vegetation in new areas to increase water retention and reduce erosion. Next slide. So there are also TCAM workshops that are offered to assist communities in adapting the TCAM to meet their needs. The workshops are 2.5 days usually, and the general process follows 5 steps. The first is to define management objectives, then assess climate impacts, evaluate management objectives, identify adaptation approaches outlined in the TCAM, which are most suitable in the particular circumstance. So as I spoke to earlier, this would be kind of going through and selecting which options best suit your community's needs. And then finally, monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of those approaches. Next slide. Yeah, so that's all for my presentation. If you have any questions, I do encourage you to contact me at the email that's up on this slide.
Thanks so much, Krystal, for that great overview of some great tools and examples that can be accessed to complement this work. Up next, we have Brennan Vogel from the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation and Emily Ammon from Green Communities Canada to overview and talk about nature-based solutions that have multiple co-benefits and can be individually pursued. So beamed again, Brennan and Emily.
Miigwech, thank you. Good to be with everyone this afternoon. I hope everyone is doing well. So in this presentation, we're going to do a little bit of a big picture to the ground level, look at how nature-based solutions at the community scale can effectively support resiliency to climate change impacts. And as you can see from our first slide here, if we were to generalize what's happening to our national climate as well as internationally, we are seeing warmer, wetter, and stormier weather conditions leading to a host of different climate change impacts across the country. Certainly the Western Canadian Arctic has experienced some of the most dramatic climate change, not only in Canada, but internationally, averaging above 3 degrees warmer in recent years than it did just 50 years prior. Next slide, please. And so when we're looking at moving from large-scale projections and scenarios around the impacts of climate change, we can see historical evidence of the climate changing, and we understand that the future warming of the Earth is directly correlated to our efforts to mitigate greenhouse gases, but some level of climate change is already baked in due to the lag times and inertia of the climate system, where greenhouse gases do remain aloft for hundreds to thousands of years. And so as we move forward, adaptation avoiding harm and seeking out opportunities for resiliency is very important, as there will be more storms and floods as we're seeing, and this is going to have a different geographic impact, particularly for Indigenous peoples across the country, depending on the level of risk and vulnerability, as we've been hearing about throughout the webinar series. Generally speaking, Indigenous communities do have a higher vulnerability, risk, and exposure to climate change risks, particularly for flooding, as well as for other types of disasters, for example, wildfires, as we saw in British Columbia last summer. And so it is very important, if not critical at this time, that we think about how we co-design and have decision-oriented research such as this project to promote better knowledge mobilization in service of being prepared and building capacity for adaptation at that ground level, particularly in Indigenous communities. Next slide. This is to Emily.
So there's many things that we can do on the landscape to improve water retention and to steward the land and avoid flooding. This slide is just, it's a pretty classic image that's used to show runoff and the way that the water cycle works when we're in a natural environment. So that's the before. So precipitation gets intercepted by forestry and is retained in the landscape and can be infiltrated back down to the water table. And there's very little surface runoff in a natural environment. However, through urbanization, we have replaced our porous surfaces with hard surfaces, which create quite a bit of surface runoff and which can lead to increased risk of flood. And so hard surfaces lead to increased stormwater runoff, which also picks up pollutants, which can damage local water quality and increase risk to infrastructure and to people. And so there are a number of different things that individuals can do to try to improve or reduce the risks of flood, but also improve their local environments. Some suggestions that we've put in here include planting native plants and prairie grasses, wildflowers, trees, and rain gardens. These are different types of planting methods which can reduce stormwater flow and help to infiltrate stormwater back down into groundwater tables. Particularly, rain gardens are an interesting and applicable strategy or intervention to reduce stormwater, where a bowl-shaped depression, basically a garden which has a flat bottom and raised edges, is planted with a downspout from local development leading into it. And so the runoff from the roof and from the parking lot or wherever else it may be coming from gets diverted directly into this garden. And that garden is then planted with native pollinator species and wild prairie grasses and flowers, which have very deep root systems, which both take up the pollutants and nutrients from that water, as well as help to infiltrate that water back down into the ground. Another strategy is to disconnect downspouts and instead install a rain barrel or cistern to retain that storm flow and use it for local planting projects or local irrigation. Another strategy, particularly in urban contexts, is to make sure that storm drains are clear in advance of large weather events. So people can, do the neighborly thing of adopting a storm drain and making sure that, particularly now when we've got the spring thaw going on, a lot of trash, it becomes more visible if people were littering in the snow and things like that. And there will be a lot of water flow right now because of the thaw as well as the spring rains. And so making sure that those storm drains are clear, that there's not debris from litter or from leaf matter blocking those storm drains during an event. And then finally, a strategy that at Green Communities Canada we promote and that a program that we fund is called Paved Paradise, and we work with communities to help them identify areas of unused asphalt in their community. They come together and they break it up and they remove it and replace it with green spaces, creating that lasting transformation at a larger scale.
Okay, so those are some great interventions and ideas for managing stormwater at the community scale. And this is some examples of partnership projects between Lower Thames Conservation Authority and Moravian Town First Nation, which is located downstream on the Dashkan-Zibi Thames River floodplain. And in this particular project has been looking at restoration of wetlands as a way of having that natural sequestration of stormwater and cleansing of that water in the watershed. Next slide. Other activities at Moravian Town include things like tree planting in the wellhead area as again a way of better managing and having natural biofiltration of waters that the community depends on in that context. Over 10,000 trees have been planted, and then of course supporting biodiversity. And through a holistic approach to thinking about land management is important at Delaware as it is in our other partner communities on this project. So there's a few examples of good things happening at Moravian Town, and there's other examples as well. Chippewas of the Thames has partnered locally with alternative land use services, for example, to do riparian zone restoration to deal with some of those issues that were highlighted in the video from Roussel around bank erosion and ensuring good ecological buffering capacity of the banks, as well as promoting their sustainability through better vegetation management. Next slide. And so we'll just conclude, I guess, with a few safety tips for folks on the call who are involved in floodplain management, particularly in Indigenous communities. Of course, dealing with the root of the problem through better nature-based solutions and adaptation and more resilient ecosystems is very important. But also is collaboration with conservation authorities, as we've been working on through this project. And this is very important, as the conservation authorities are Ontario's designated flood warning, forecasting, and response preparedness is something that they also deal with. So we've been building better communication ties on the project to share community flood warnings and updates. Of course, part of flood response is being prepared at your household community level by having what you need in place. This includes water, non-perishable foods, medications, and so on. Some basic precautions around not getting too close to the river, as tragedies, as we've seen here in Ontario this spring, can occur unexpectedly. So it's very important to keep children and pets away from flooded ditches and river areas to avoid those types of tragic circumstances like we saw in the headwaters of the Thames earlier this spring. Checking in on those who are vulnerable and disabled in the community is also very important, and at your property level, ensuring that your infrastructure related to keeping your basements dry through sump pumps and backwater valves, as well as other flood prevention measures, are operable and functioning is a key part of flood preparedness and resiliency. Next slide.
So we just wanted to drop a few resources here. Green Communities Canada offers some self-directed courses online, including the Rain Garden Masterclass, which teaches people how to build and design their very own rain garden, residential rain gardens. We also have a self-directed course called Rain as a Resource, which is completely free, which teaches people how to advocate for more sustainable stormwater management, as well as identify different ways of slowing down, soaking up, and keeping rainwater clean. And finally, the Paved Paradise program is a flagship program for us, which I previously described, in which we work with communities to break up asphalt and replace it with native planted green spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miigwech. And if there are questions, our emails are available here and we'll pop them in the chat as well. Thanks.
Miigwech, Brennan and Emily, great information, which really starts to reflect the Indigenous perspectives in regards to recognizing and utilizing the natural environment as it has been meant to be utilized, and how we as individuals can participate in adapting, mitigating, and being prepared for events caused by climate change, such as flooding. Our final presentation will be given by another familiar face, and he will give us an overview of some of the tools that help us to manage that risk. So over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much. Yes, I actually have two brief presentations to finish up this section. We are running a little bit late, so hopefully everybody can hang around for the next 10 minutes or so to finish up with me. I'm going to start with a presentation on flood forecasting and warning as a tool of risk management. Next slide, please. So, in many communities, development already exists in the flood-prone areas, and the floodplain mapping that we're talking about in these sessions helps show where these areas are located, and even may show the level of risk. Flood forecasting is often seen as the best way to mitigate the risk. By warning people in advance of potential flooding, people can take action to limit the damages to their property and reduce their personal risk. Next, please. So I'm going to start with talking about the responsibilities of various levels of government during a potential flood. So next, please. So starting with the federal government in Canada, they're largely responsible for weather forecasting and releasing weather-related warnings. They also partner in the required monitoring networks, including weather networks and stream gauging networks. And these are largely done through Environment and Climate Change Canada and its various branches. The federal government will also provide an additional emergency response support when it's requested by the province. Next slide. So now provincial responsibilities, and these can vary, depending on the province, but generally speaking, every province is going to maintain some level of a provincial level flood forecasting and warning system. And they're going to partner with the federal government in the monitoring network. They may operate some flood control infrastructure, and like the federal government, they're going to provide additional emergency response support when it's requested by lower level of government, a municipality or community. Next slide. So moving down to the community, how they deal with the flood can also vary depending on the province they're in and their capabilities. But generally, they're responsible for the flooding and emergency response levels. Based on what the information they have and their resources are available. So there shouldn't be an expectation that a small rural municipality is going to be able to respond the same way that a large city can. And the kind of things that, a community or municipality typically takes care of is, providing information directly to people affected by flooding, traffic control, fire, looting prevention, rescuing people, evacuations, providing medical assistance, providing social services, to help those affected. And then depending on your own province, there could be flood forecasting warning.
We'll be down there as quick as we can. I probably, I don't know that it'll be 2 hours or something like that.
Art, could you please put mute? Thank you. Flood forecasting, they, depending on the province and the capabilities, they may also have some limited flood forecasting capabilities or infrastructure that they operate. So next slide. And then finally, personal responsibilities. Everybody has certain responsibilities. The first is to know the risks and know what to do in the event of a flood emergency. Don't interfere with drainage. Don't fill in local drainage ditches in your area. Discussed earlier about cleaning leaves around catch basins. Also remove important objects from the flood prone areas when there's a warning about flooding. Don't leave it to get damaged. And inform responsible administrative staff in your community about your potential concerns, perhaps your own personal risks or risks related to your property. Next slide. Now, I'm going to briefly talk about conservation authorities because, in Ontario, they're kind of unique and it's due to the fact that it's just so many people in flood-prone areas due to the the long history of development in Ontario. Basically, conservation authorities kind of sit between the province and the municipality and kind of have the responsibilities of kind of both of those agencies. So conservation authorities in Ontario do flood forecasting and warning systems, and they'll also operate some infrastructure and work with various municipalities across the watersheds to coordinate on regional flood control and emergency responses. So next slide. So now what goes into a flood forecasting and warning program? Next. So, the first thing you need is weather, and weather information is available from a variety of sources. I mentioned Environment Canada is the first one. They'll announce their weather warnings on the radio. You can also find information on websites, or there's apps to download onto your phones. And as a local person with flood responsibilities, with some experience, you may come to learn, how much rain is going to cause flooding issues in your community. Next. The next piece of information you need is stuff coming out of the gauge network. Gauges tell us what precipitation we actually had and how high the water levels are upstream. And how high the water levels are upstream, helps forecasters predict what's coming down the river to affect other areas. Gauge networks can be, again, slightly different depending on the province you're in, but generally speaking, Environment and Climate Change Canada maintains a base network of gauges across the country, which then may be supplemented by a province or locals. And the Environment Canada, data is all posted online for people. Here's an example of where you could get hydrometric data. Next slide. So once you have your information, the next piece is the actual flood forecasting. And this slide is more about an Ontario example, but basically you have like a provincial level program to look out for broad flooding potential. Being a provincial agency, they may have some more tools available that a small community might not have. Then it goes down to more local or regional. In Ontario, those would be conservation authorities, or it could be, a district branch of a provincial ministry who are going to look at something more closer. And then, at a municipal or community level, you have community flood coordinators or other responsible administrative staff who can look at messages and look at forecasts and understand the local impacts. Next slide. So once the forecasting done, the message has got to get out. And so there tends to be standard messages. In Ontario, there was an attempt to coordinate the naming of messages to match what the weather forecasters are using. Across there's going to be standard messages across the country. The messages get distributed to responsible staff in the various communities and agencies through various methods, email, posting on websites. There may be other tools like Twitter. And depending on the region, they may or may not be directed directly to private individuals or private residents. The messages that get put out often get picked up by the media and get spread around. And then sometimes individuals at risk in the flood-prone areas will need to be contacted directly. And it's typically the agency responsible for flood response that does this. And I'll say, as a person who does flood forecasting, maintaining an updated contact list is always a challenge. Next slide. So then it comes down to response. And as I said, everybody has a responsibility during a flood. There's going to be multiple groups are out monitoring how the events unfold, from your forecasters to the emergency response people. There's going to be typically some people operating flood control structures during this. But really, it's going to be, the municipality or the local community that takes on the bulk of the flood response activity. But every event is different, and and each partner in the response program, has different resources it can bring. Next slide. Okay, so now we wanted to talk about local drainage issues, and we want to talk about this because as we were going through our project, it became recognized that this type of flooding is something that was really important, but wasn't really being addressed by the floodplain mapping portion of this project. So next slide. So what do we mean by local drainage issues? It's basically flooding caused by heavy rains, not typically associated with a water course. Basically, an area lacks the ability to drain the water fast enough, and typically they can't be mapped like a floodplain. These are often seen in urban areas where we would call them stormwater issues. Next slide. So what are some examples? You can see flooded roads or flooded yards, flooded farm fields, where there's no water course or ditch to drain into. Another example could be groundwater getting into basements, or small drainage features, catch basins, that kind of stuff, far from their outlet that just simply get overwhelmed. And again, in urban areas, we describe it as insufficient stormwater infrastructure. Next slide. Now, what about flood forecasting these? Well, they're very difficult to forecast. There's often no delay between the rain and the resulting flooding. The problem areas typically aren't mapped. And, one of the reasons could be that just the issues are too localized for anyone but a few homeowners in an area to know that there's a flooding problem there without, having to tell somebody. And oftentimes, heavy rain can be very localized, and you only have so much resources to put out a rain gauge network there. So our sparse rain gauge networks may simply miss these areas where the heavy rains hit, and therefore it's impossible to forecast. So next slide. So what are some solutions? Well, in urbanized areas, this is typically improvements to stormwater infrastructure. Some pumps, backwater valves, swales, storm sewers, green infrastructure like we talked about. And in rural areas, it could be involved digging drainage ditches or agricultural field tiling. And in either of these situations, it may involve collaboration between various landowners or between Indigenous communities and nearby settler communities, to try to get your solutions to your drainage issues taken care of. Next slide. So, how do we deal with these? Well, you need some kind of local drainage planning process. And, in some cases, these local drainage issues could be even larger concerns than floodplain issues because they recur so often, whereas a big flood might not really occur that often. And every community is going to have its own process, and each flooding issue may have a slightly different process as well. But one of the first steps is, for the residents of these communities to let the local administrative staff know that there is a problem. Because if they don't know the problem, then you can't try to solve it. Next slide. So that's it for my presentations. Here's my contact info if anybody has any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks once again, Jason, for all that great information that you shared with us, not just today, but throughout this series. With that, once again, we have reached our time, and being that this is the final session of the series, any unanswered questions, we ask you to email any of the team whose information has been given throughout the session. We will be emailing all registrants links to the recordings as well as the PDFs of the slide decks. The recordings to the webinars 1 through 4 can be found on the Green Communities YouTube page at the following links, and they will be posted in the chat as well as the Cambium Indigenous Professional Services website, which the link will be posted as well. These sessions have all been full of information that we hope for the Indigenous participants has given you understanding into the important process, and for our non-Indigenous participants, some context and insight of our perspectives and the importance of meaningfully including those perspectives into the work on all aspects. Collectively, we hope that you will have all learned just a little in regards to the importance and benefits of ensuring that we are all building respectful reciprocal relationships and openly communicating and collaborating. On behalf of our team, I would like to say Gitchi Miigwech, a big thank you for attending, and we would really appreciate if you took a moment to fill in the quick online survey. A link will be provided in the chat box. Gitchi Miigwech again to all that attended and presented today, and for all those efforts put forth by our team. With that, we have Courtney Riley, who was unable to attend in person today, but has been able to send a recording to close us off in a good way.
Bonjour. Again, for a closing for our series here, I am going to offer up the travel song, and just a little bit about the travel song. The travel song can be shared for closing, like as in today, closing out ceremony, closing out a workshop or event, and also can be sung at funerals as we send our loved ones on to the spirit world. So I send you safe travels wherever you're traveling today, and also safe travels throughout the rest of your life, through life.